Every MMA organization explained what every fan should know. There's a fight happening right now somewhere in the world, and chances are you've never heard of the organization putting it on. While everyone knows the UFC, there's an entire underground ecosystem of MMA promotions scattered across the globe, some worth billions, others operating out of basketball gyms with folding chairs. And here's the crazy part. Some of these unknown organizations are actually producing better fights than what you see on ESPN. Look, I've been deep in the MMA world for years, and there's a massive misconception that the UFC is all that matters. That's like saying McDonald's is the only restaurant that exists. The reality is there are over 400 active MMA organizations worldwide, each with their own rules, their own stars, and their own wild stories that would make Dana White's head spin. By the end of this video, you'll understand how this entire industry actually works and why some of the best fights you've never seen are happening in places you've never heard of. The Big Four, the giants of MMA. Let's start with the obvious heavyweight. The UFC, Ultimate Fighting Championship, isn't just an organization, it's a $12 billion empire that turned cage fighting into mainstream entertainment. But here's what most people don't realize. The UFC only has about 600 fighters under contract. That's it. In a sport with thousands of professional fighters worldwide, the UFC represents maybe 5% of the total talent pool. The UFC's genius wasn't just putting on fights, it was creating a brand so powerful that casual fans think UFC and MMA are the same thing. They've got the best production, the biggest marketing budget, and they've convinced everyone that their octagon is the only place that matters. But that's about to change your perspective completely. One championship, and this is where it gets interesting, is actually bigger than the UFC in terms of viewership. Yeah, you heard that right. While the UFC dominates North America, one championship owns Asia, and Asia has 4.6 billion people. Their events regularly pull 50+ million viewers across television and streaming platforms. One championship has created legitimate superstars that most Western fans have never heard of. Angela Lee became the atomweight champion at just 19 years old and has defended her title multiple times while building a massive following across Asia. Demetrius Johnson, after leaving the UFC, found new life in ONE and won their flyweight Grand Prix, proving he's still one of the best pound-for-pound fighters in the world. Rodtang Jitmuangnon has become their Muay Thai superstar, with a fighting style so aggressive and entertaining that he's transcended combat sports to become a genuine celebrity in Thailand. But ONE doesn't just do MMA. They've created this hybrid combat sports entertainment that includes Muay Thai, kickboxing, and submission grappling all on the same card. Imagine if the UFC suddenly started booking prime Mike Tyson against Canelo Alvarez between MMA fights. That's the level of variety ONE brings to the table. Bellator MMA used to be the clear number 2 in North America, and they've got something the UFC doesn't. They're not afraid to book absolute freak show fights. Remember when they had Kimbo Slice fight Dada 5000 and both guys nearly died from exhaustion? That was peak Bellator chaos, and honestly, it was more entertaining than half the UFC cards that year. Bellator has been home to some incredible talent that the UFC overlooked or let go. Patricio Pitbull Freire became a simultaneous 2-division champion and is arguably one of the best featherweights in the world, period. Ryan Bader left the UFC and became Bellator's heavyweight and light heavyweight champion simultaneously. Gegard Mousasi, after a frustrating UFC run, found new life in Bellator and went on a tear that reminded everyone why he's one of the most skilled middleweights ever. PFL, Professional Fighters League, took this tournament concept and turned it into a season-based sport with a $1 million prize for each division winner. Think of it as the NFL of MMA, regular season, playoffs, championship. It's the only organization where you know exactly what a fighter is competing for and when they'll get their shot. PFL has attracted some serious talent with their $1 million prizes. Kayla Harrison, a 2-time Olympic judo gold medalist, dominated their women's lightweight division for 2 seasons before moving to the UFC. Anthony Pettis, former UFC lightweight champion, found success in PFL's welterweight tournament. Francis Ngannou shocked the MMA world by leaving the UFC to sign with PFL, bringing heavyweight star power to their roster. The regional powerhouses where legends are born. Now let's talk about where the real magic happens, the regional scene. This is where every UFC champion started, where hungry fighters take any fight for $500 and a chance to prove themselves. Cage Warriors in Europe is basically the UFC's unofficial feeder league. Conor McGregor was tearing through their featherweight and lightweight divisions simultaneously before the UFC came calling. Michael Bisping cut his teeth there in the early 2000s. Paddy Pimblett became their biggest star, selling out arenas across the UK before making his UFC debut. Jack Shore, Molly McCann, and Paul Craig all used Cage Warriors as their launching pad to UFC stardom. What makes Cage Warriors special is their scouting network. They've got talent scouts in every major European city, and they're not just looking for the best fighters. They're looking for the most marketable ones. They understand that personality sells fights just as much as skill does. Risen Fighting Federation in Japan is where MMA gets weird in the best possible way. They've got everything from traditional MMA to open-weight Grand Prix tournaments where a 155-pound guy might face a 265-pound monster. Tenshin Nasukawa, their kickboxing superstar, became so famous that Floyd Mayweather came out of retirement to fight him in an exhibition. Mikuru Asakura has become one of Japan's biggest MMA stars, with a YouTube channel that rivals major media outlets in viewership. Rizin also does something no other major organization will touch. They book MMA versus other martial arts. We're talking MMA fighters against kickboxers, grapplers against strikers, sometimes even exhibition matches that blur the line between sport and entertainment. Kyoji Horiguchi, former UFC flyweight contender, found a home in Rizin and became their bantamweight champion while simultaneously holding the Bellator bantamweight title. KSW, Konfrontacja Sztuk Walki, in Poland has created something unique. They've turned MMA into a legitimate mainstream sport in their country. Mamet Khalidov became a legitimate national hero, headlining events that sell out 50,000-seat soccer stadiums. Joanna Jedrzejczyk got her start in KSW before becoming UFC strawweight champion. Jan Blachowicz was a KSW light heavyweight champion before eventually winning the UFC title. The specialists, organizations with a twist. Here's where MMA gets really interesting. The organizations that took the basic concept and added their own flavor. ADCC, Abu Dhabi Combat Club, isn't technically MMA, but it's where the best grapplers in the world prove who's the king of the ground game. Gordon Ryan has dominated recent ADCC tournaments and is considered the best no-guy grappler of all time. Andre Galvao was an ADCC champion who successfully transitioned to MMA. When an ADCC champion transitions to MMA, they bring a level of ground control that's almost unfair. Glory Kickboxing represents the striking side of combat sports, and their athletes are some of the most technically perfect strikers you'll ever see. Rico Verhoeven has been their heavyweight champion for years and is considered one of the best heavyweight kickboxers ever. Israel Adesanya was a Glory middleweight contender before becoming UFC middleweight champion, bringing that elite-level striking to MMA. Invicta FC solved a problem the UFC couldn't figure out for years: how to properly showcase women's MMA. Chris Cyborg dominated their featherweight division before moving to the UFC. Michelle Waterson was their atomweight champion. Barb Honchak and Carla Esparza both used Invicta as a stepping stone to UFC success. The Wild West, organizations where anything goes. Now we get to the really fun stuff. The organizations that operate in the gray areas of combat sports regulation. Bare Knuckle Fighting Championship, BKFC, took boxing, removed the gloves, and somehow made it both more brutal and more technical at the same time. Paige Van Zandt left the UFC to sign with BKFC and has become one of their biggest stars. Mike Perry made the transition from UFC to BKFC and found new life in bare knuckle boxing. Chad Mendes, former UFC featherweight contender, has found success in BKFC's unique format. Slap Fighting Championship has turned the playground game of slapping into a legitimate sport with weight classes, rankings, and pay-per-view events. Vasily Komotsky, known as Dumpling, became their biggest star with his incredible slapping power and entertaining personality. Street Beefs operates out of a backyard in Virginia and has become a legitimate pipeline for discovering raw talent. Chris Wilmore, who founded Street Beefs, has helped dozens of people settle their differences in a controlled environment. Some of these backyard warriors have legitimate skills that would translate to professional MMA with proper training. The international scene, MMA around the world. M1 Global in Russia has produced some of the most technically sound fighters in the world. Fedor Emelianenko was their biggest star and is considered by many to be the greatest heavyweight of all time. Alexander Shlemenko was their middleweight champion, who later found success in Bellator. Their emphasis on sambo and wrestling creates fighters with grappling bases that often overwhelm more well-rounded opponents. Shuto in Japan is one of the oldest MMA organizations in the world, and they've maintained a focus on technical excellence over entertainment value. Takanori Gomi was a Shudo champion before becoming a Pride and UFC star. Masakatsu Funaki was one of their early pioneers who helped establish MMA in Japan. EFC, Extreme Fighting Championship in Africa, has created a unique style that blends traditional African martial arts with modern MMA techniques. Dricus du Plessis used EFC as his launching pad before eventually becoming UFC middleweight champion. Don Madge was their lightweight champion before making his UFC debut. The legends who built organizations. Some organizations were built around specific legendary fighters. Pride Fighting Championships in Japan was built around stars like Fedor Emelianenko, Mirko Krokop, Filipovic, Quinton Rampage, Jackson, Shogun Rua, and Ricardo Arona. These weren't just fighters, they were gladiators performing in front of 90,000 people in soccer stadiums. Strikeforce gave us some of the most memorable moments in MMA history. Nick Diaz had his legendary run there, including his war with Paul Daly. Gilbert Melendez was their lightweight king. The women's divisions featured Ronda Rousey, Miesha Tate, and Sarah Kaufman, putting on fights that were often more exciting than the men's bouts. WEC, World Extreme Cage Fighting, was where the lighter weight classes proved they belonged in major MMA. Jose Aldo was their featherweight champion and put on some of the most spectacular performances in MMA history. Urijah Faber was the face of the organization and proved that smaller fighters could be just as exciting as heavyweights. Ben Henderson, Anthony Pettis, and Donald Cerrone all made their names in WEC. The business side? How these organizations actually work. Here's something most fans don't understand. These organizations operate on completely different business models. The UFC makes money from pay-per-view, television deals, and merchandise. But smaller organizations, they're often loss leaders designed to promote other businesses. Many regional promotions are owned by gym owners who use the events to showcase their fighters and attract new students. Others are funded by local businesses looking for marketing opportunities in their communities. Some are passion projects by wealthy MMA fans who just want to see good fights happen. The economics are brutal. A regional show might cost $50,000 to put on and only generate $30,000 in revenue. But if it leads to one fighter getting signed to the UFC, that gym owner just created a marketing story worth millions in free publicity. The pipeline, how fighters move between organizations. Understanding MMA organizations means understanding the pipeline. Fighters typically start in amateur organizations, move to small regional shows, then to larger regional promotions, and finally to major organizations. But it's not always linear. Some fighters prefer to be big fish in small ponds. Eddie Alvarez bounced between the UFC, Bellator, and one championship, always finding success and good paydays. Rory McDonald left the UFC for Bellator and became their welterweight champion. They'll turn down UFC contracts to stay in organizations where they're treated like stars, make good money, and don't have to deal with the pressure of performing on the biggest stage. Others use smaller organizations as comeback vehicles. Tito Ortiz had a successful run in Bellator after his UFC career ended. Frank Mir found new life in Bellator's heavyweight division. Former UFC fighters who've been cut often rebuild their careers in other major organizations, proving they still have elite-level skills before potentially returning to the UFC. The future, where MMA organizations are heading. The landscape is changing rapidly. Streaming services are creating new opportunities for smaller organizations to reach global audiences without traditional television deals. Social media allows fighters to build personal brands that transcend their organizations. We're also seeing more specialization. Instead of trying to be everything to everyone, successful organizations are finding niches, whether that's women's MMA, heavyweight tournaments, or specific regional markets. The UFC's monopoly-like control is slowly being challenged not by one competitor, but by dozens of smaller organizations that collectively offer fighters more options and fans more variety. The hidden gems, fights you've missed. Some of the best fights in MMA history didn't happen in the UFC. Pride FC's 2005 middleweight Grand Prix featuring Ricardo Arona, Quinton Jackson, Yuki Kondo, and Alistair Overeem produced better fights than any UFC tournament. Strikeforce's women's divisions with Ronda Rousey versus Miesha Tate were more competitive than anything the UFC offered for years. Current One Championship cards with fighters like Demetrius Johnson and Rod Tang regularly feature more finishes and less lay and pray than UFC events. So there you have it. The complete ecosystem of MMA organizations, from billion-dollar empires to backyard brawls, and the legendary fighters who made them famous. The UFC might be the biggest, but it's just one piece of a massive, complex, and incredibly entertaining puzzle. The next time someone tells you they're an MMA fan but only watch UFC, you'll know they're missing about 95% of what this sport has to offer. There are incredible fighters, amazing stories, and unforgettable moments happening in organizations around the world every single weekend. But here's my question for you. Which of these fighters surprised you the most? Did you know Demetrius Johnson found new success in one championship? Had you ever heard of Mamed Khalidov selling out 50,000-seat stadiums in Poland? And most importantly, which organization are you going to check out first? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and let me know if there's a specific organization or fighter you want me to dive deeper into. Hit that like button if this opened your eyes to how massive the MMA world really is. And subscribe because we're just getting started exploring the stories that mainstream MMA media won't tell you. Also, let me know what aspect of MMA organizations you want to explore next. Should we break down the business side of how these promotions make money? Or maybe dive into the specific rules differences that make each organization unique? The rabbit hole goes deep, and I'm here to guide you through all of it. Until next time, remember, the best fight you've never seen is probably happening right now in an organization you've never heard of, featuring a fighter who could be the next Conor McGregor or Anderson Silva. And that's exactly what makes this sport so incredible.